Hello, good morning and welcome to today's panel discussion with CMS Distribution and Red Hat around Agile Integration and Management and Automation. So just to do a few quick introductions. So my name is Andy Gilbert. I'm Red Hat Business Manager here at CMS Distribution. With me today are Matt York and Phil Prosser, Senior Solution Architects from Red Hat. So welcome guys, thanks for joining us today. So I've worked with Red Hat and Red Hat partners for about 17 years now. So I've got quite broad knowledge, or so I would like to think, of Red Hat technologies. But I've seen sort of the evolution of Red Hat from being just a Linux vendor to, I guess, what's certainly viewed as now as a true enabler of digital transformation. And I think that Red Hat has now got a very, very broad product portfolio. So we're going to kind of take a bit of time to talk about two aspects of that today. But I'm just going to have a quick run through of where Red Hat's technologies kind of sit in terms of business challenges that organizations typically face today. So certainly with Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and that sits within what Red Hat call the IT optimization piece. So this is around optimizing the IT that you have, getting the most out of your existing systems and gaining efficiency. We have Agile Integration, so that's all around integrating your applications, data, processes to ensure that you can actually improve your productivity, and that's an area that we'll be looking into in a little bit more detail. Hybrid cloud infrastructure, so adding and managing cloud infrastructure, whether that's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, so containerization, and hybrid cloud management. Cloud native app development, becoming more and more important for organizations that want to build and develop more modern applications and get them into production much, much faster. And then kind of across all of those areas, we have the need for automation and management. So achieving all of that, but being able to kind of orchestrate and scale. I think that's probably fair to kind of very briefly in a nutshell cover where Red Hat's technologies sit. But we'll start off talking about Agile Integration. And Phil, if I kind of give my general understanding of what that is, and then you can expand upon it. So I guess a lot of it comes down to sort of the increasing complexity of IT environments today. Companies have more and more systems that need to be connected. Environments are being more complex with the adoption of cloud. You've got different platforms, applications and data sources. They all need to kind of talk to each other, share that information and run smoothly. And that's at an absolute basic level what integration is. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely, Andy. So integration is about traditionally how do I get my applications to talk to each other? But the challenge that we're faced with today is the speed of IT has changed dramatically with the things that you talked about. So you talked about digital and people implementing digital type applications. Those both need to come to market a lot quicker, but equally they use different styles of development. So things like microservices, for example. So the traditional approach with ESBs and that type of approach leads to sort of a bimodal IT basically. So your ESB tends to sit lovely, looking after the legacy, looking after those back office applications, but it just isn't suited to digital type applications. So we need integration to move at the speed of digital innovation basically, and that's why we see a change, and that's why Red Hat came up with the Agile Integration architecture.
Okay, thank you. And what makes Agile Integration agile? And how does that really kind of differ from that traditional model?
Okay, so again, coming back to how we develop applications now, people tend to think about delivering an application quickly. And when I mean quickly, putting new features into production either daily, weekly, or monthly at the latest, rather than this 6-monthly, 12-monthly approach that we used to have with the old way of doing things. And so as a result of doing that, people have started to use this concept of microservice architecture And whilst it brings its own complexities, what it does allow us to do is to make change quick and isolate change quick and put those changes right into production quickly. And so what we need is an integration technology that can do that with us as well. So we need an integration technology that can be deployed as microservices in its own right. So it takes part and becomes part of the microservice architecture. It's provided to developers, so it's the developers that actually have these tools that allow them to do the integration that they require, whether that's even just orchestrating their own microservices. So one of the things I talk about a lot is this whole thing of, if I've got 10 microservices, for argument's sake, that make up my application, how do I expose that API as an API out to consumers that want to consume it? I can't expect them to do the orchestration of my microservices for me. I need to put a layer above that gives holistic APIs that they can consume. What it then needs to do, and what makes it agile, is having the ability to have it fit into an agile development methodology. So we tend to think about container-based deployment, for example. We tend to think about API management and being able to expose those services out to the outside world. And we tend to think about very lightweight frameworks. We don't need big things. We need things that are small, cloud native, stateless, and those things that can help me do that. And then to be able to build integration into my normal CI/CD process. So as I make changes, I can automate end to end, putting my changes into production. If I do release quickly, I can't have manual steps in that process. And that's what a lot of customers have done with their microservices based development, and Agile Integration needs to do exactly the same thing.
Okay, great. And is there a particular or specific kind of profile or type of organization that really benefits from this kind of technology, or is it across all industry types, all verticals?
So I would say it's across all industry, and more so across industries that are struggling to remain competitive. So if we look at a lot of the new businesses that we've seen arrive in the last 5 to 10 years versus those that have been around 100 years, it's those 100-year-old companies that are struggling. And so without adoption of this type of approach, they will go out of business. It's as simple as that. And we've spoken to lots of different customers over my time at Red Hat, and I've seen some of those customers go broke as a result of them not actually adopting and innovating these type of approaches. If they don't innovate, it's do or die, and they need to become disruptive. And so it goes across industry without a shadow of a doubt, but certainly the sort of retail, manufacturing, the FSI market with open banking and those type of things, it becomes really important. But equally out to government as well. So if you look at government organisations, and it's everybody knows that doing a digital transaction is so much cheaper than ringing the call centre. And so, and then when you look at my son, for example, he doesn't want to ring anybody up anyway. So the only way that those guys can engage their audience is by adopting these type of capabilities. So it goes cross-market, basically.
Well, I guess that comes down to sort of, you know, some of the, what you'd consider the more modern, newer companies out there. They kind of have the opportunity to build their infrastructure using modern technology, whereas some of the older, more legacy organizations, they've got legacy infrastructure, and that's where the challenge is. How do you build a new modern architecture alongside that and make everything talk to each other?
Yeah, and that's really where Red Hat comes in. And even if you look at analysts like Gartner, they recognise, and we recognise, the whole thing of bimodal IT. So we can't get rid of the old as much as we would like to get rid of the old. And so the old has to be sort of ring fenced in a different mode of operation, basically. So doing the sort of traditional IT based ways. But what those companies then need to recognise is that they need innovation that sits around that. And they need, and where Red Hat helps is to provide that sort of innovation layer. So when we look at our technology, we have sort of 3 pillars of operation in terms of Agile Integration. So firstly, it's a platform to be able to build things on and allow developers the freedom, basically, to try things out on a platform where they can deploy things in hours or days rather than weeks and months. and at very little cost to their organization. So that's the platform, and that's what we would look at as being an OpenShift platform. And then on there, they need this sort of container-based deployment model, of which we can do with our Red Hat Fuse technology and deploy integrations as containers. And then ultimately, what we also see, and again, learnings from the new organizations around, a lot of those newer organizations have scaled via API. So it's not all about just sort of exposing a portal, a web application, and all of those good things that you can think of as a business. It's exposing your API and then letting others innovate around it, basically. So by doing that, it's separation of that, and then allowing the organization to do that and giving them the tools and freedom for them to be able to innovate.
And is it quite common that there needs to be sort of a culture shift within an organisation to implement this methodology as well? Because it's not just about the technology, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, again, one of the things that we talk about a lot is that you know, I'm an old guy, so I used to work back in the day when we had development teams and we had operations teams, and my job was to write code, and then if the operations guys were lucky, I would throw it over the wall with a sort of a document that tells them how to deploy it. These days, however, it's recognized that that's just too slow. So that brings in the whole sort of DevOps culture that we need to adopt. And that's what a lot of organizations do with microservice-based development. It's ownership within the application or product team, and that ownership is owned by development and operations guys working together. And automation becomes a key part of that working together. And so the developer, I'm basically now creating an integration that creates a container image, and that container image now becomes my deployment unit, basically. And then if I use CI/CD pipelines, I can automate that whole process of moving my integration into production, and my operations guys are really now responsible for running my platform. So in our case, the OpenShift platform that they would run for me, it is my responsibility to make sure as the developer that my integration works, scales, and does all the things it needs to do when it is in production.
Great, thank you. Are there any sort of particular challenges, either whether it is technical or it's cultural, within organisations that you've been working on these types of projects with? Any sort of particular issues that you have to kind of look out for, and how you might overcome some of those?
So the biggest issue, without shadow of a doubt, is, and coming back to my point earlier about companies going out of business that we've been talking to, the biggest issue is change and the need to change. If we look at the technology, we have the technology to be able to deploy these platforms. We have the technologies to be able to do the integration. We have the technology that scales and is secure and all of those good things. We have the API management layer, so we can expose our services and manage and govern them. And it really is about people wanting to change. And without that desire to change, none of this will ever take off in a company. And that has to start at the top of the company. So it's basically a culture change that has to come from the top down to enable people to be able to feel that I've got my platform, I've got my technology, and I'm empowered to innovate, basically. So,
yeah, and I guess that's why, you know, people talk about the cost of standing still, because they know if they don't change, if they don't innovate, then they're effectively going to get left behind. So yeah, that makes sense. So you talked about these pillars of the Agile integration. So talking about microservices, containerization, and API management. If you've got more information, you can kind of go into a little bit more detail on those.
yeah, okay. So I mentioned earlier we have the platform. So the platform is the first pillar, and the platform is Red Hat OpenShift container platform. And the container platform is basically an orchestration and platform as a service capability. And the way I liken it, from my little world and where I come from, it's an application server basically for anything. And so back in the day, we would think of JBoss EAP as an application server, and it is, of course, but it can only deploy Java. And what we would tend to deploy on that are monolithic applications that don't change very often, as we were talking about before, the sort of first mode of operation in Bimodal. With a Red Hat OpenShift platform, what we're able to do is deploy anything on it. So the whole of Red Hat's middleware can be deployed and consumed on the container platform. And so that would include things like our EAP, JEE server, that would include our sort of decision management solution, our business process solution. Everything can be deployed on there. What we also then do is, looking at microservice specifically, we actually provide support for more of the common frameworks that people tend to use on that platform. So that would be things like Spring Boot, for example, Node.js, for example, Vertex, and Wildfly Swarm as ways of deploying. And what those products sort of bring to the fold is the ability to deploy standardized applications without the application server. They don't need this thing that's going to scale them, secure them, and all of those good things, because OpenShift does that for any application. So moving on to then the second pillar of that, we have our integration technology, which is Red Hat Fuse. And Red Hat Fuse is really a suite of different technologies that we might be consuming when we do integration. So the first part of that is what I would call traditional integration, but done as microservices. So that's how do I connect A to B, regardless of what A and B is. So I might be exposing an API out to the back end, but I could be talking to a legacy system. Sorry, got that the wrong way. I might be having an API out to the front end, talking to a legacy system at the back end. And what Red Hat Fuse brings is a whole ton of connectors, over 200 different connectors to connect all these different applications together. And those connectors, and one of the big things about the connector is it means that I, as a developer, I don't need to know how I put a message on a queue. I don't need to know how I write a file to the file system. I don't need to know how I call Salesforce or SAP or ServiceNow or Google Mail. The connector does all of those things for me. And then what it actually does is to say, well, within integration, there are common patterns that we would use when we do things like integration. So that would be things like orchestration of a different set of services. So one call in, multiple messages out to various different systems. It would be things like, how do I do routing of data? How do I enrich my data, transform my data, split my data, and do parallel processing as examples? And those are what we would call enterprise integration patterns. And so effectively, Red Hat Fuse allows me to then orchestrate a whole load of these enterprise integration patterns into some form of integration that makes sense for what it is that I'm doing. What we then do, as well as having the core integration piece, it's also then made up of a citizen-centric integration technology as well that we call Fuse Online. So we talk often, as I've already done, about developers doing this work, but equally there's a lot of need out there for line of business to do what I would call simple integration. So I've got Salesforce, for example, out there in the cloud, and what I need to be able to do is every time I change a customer's address, for example, in Salesforce, I need to push that change into my CRM that's running on premise or in the cloud, for example. Those type of integrations don't necessarily need an IT guy or a microservices team or whatever to actually build them. We should be able to provide a citizen-centric integration environment whereby they can point and click and do those type of integrations. So there's that part as well in terms of integration. Then the other key thing that we see a lot of as well is asynchronous messaging inside our integration. So Red Hat Fuse also includes our AMQ technology, and AMQ is made up of a message broker. It's made up of a product that we call AMQ Streams that most people would know as Kafka as part of that, and all of that can be deployed onto the OpenShift platform as well. So what that means is that I can start writing APIs whereby I have a very quick, fast response time with my consumer of my application. And what I then do is I place the message on a queue, and those messages get queued up and processed as and when the application that needs to consume them can do. And that's often very powerful when we are talking to legacy systems, when those legacy systems can't perform at the same speed or scale of the applications that we're doing in our digital layer. And then on front of that, so the third pillar within our integration, so we've had OpenShift, we've had Fuse, is then how do I expose capability? So one of the things I talked about earlier is it's not just about me as my business writing my portals, writing my mobile applications and doing all of those things. It's often about how do I expose APIs so other people can innovate around what it is that I've done. And so if you look at open banking is a great example of that, where it's mandated they will do in FSI APIs to be able to call in to the systems and for me, the consumer, to get my information out. And so we need to be able to do that securely. So we need to be able to do that in a governed way. We need to be able to allow developers to discover what APIs we've got, what the documentation that we have for those APIs, and then allow them to actually subscribe to that API to consume it. And so the third tier is all about API management and the control, security, governance of those particular APIs that we've got. And we call that Red Hat 3-scale API management. So I think that's a quick sort of overview of the three different pillars.
Yeah. And as I said, I've been working with Red Hat for 17 years, but I'm still learning stuff today. So thank you. You've talked, or you've mentioned sort of, that need for control and governance, and that's a massive topic in itself. But Matt, obviously, with your expertise around the whole kind of management and automation piece, I guess, again, that kind of comes down to a lot of the same reasons, the increasing complexities of environments, but a lot of the stuff that Phil has talked about here, that Red Hat has management solutions that tie in not only with sort of managing and automating wider things across your estate, but specifically around some of those integration challenges. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the first thing that you mentioned there, the environments are becoming more complex. This is something that we've seen, same as you, I've been in the industry for quite a while. We've seen things move from, dedicated network people, to dedicated physical networks, physical machines, and obviously VMs, and now containers and services being split across multiple sites, multiple data centers, multiple clusters. The complexity is increasing, and unfortunately, it's not going to get any easier for the guys who have to try and manage that. So, my background primarily is around infrastructure and trying to help manage some of these services from the bottom up, effectively. Absolutely, as you say, we have a number of different tools, and we have, more importantly, a number of customers that are, well, in fact, almost all of our customers who are trying to get their heads around how do we try and manage this complexity. And as Phil mentioned already, if they aren't able to help to try and get hold of this complexity and to deal with it in a consumable way, they have a big business problem, because you end up with issues around stability. How do you deliver things quickly to market? How do you make sure you're not the second guy in the race? So yeah, absolutely, infrastructure and management is critical to all of that.
And what are the typical ways that people manage infrastructure now versus the way that they can really kind of automate it with the likes of Ansible?
I think the way that they're managing things now compared to how they were perhaps a few years ago, you probably noticed, you've mentioned Ansible already. So Ansible is obviously, one of our flagship automation product that we have. It gives us the ability to manage almost anything within your IT environment in a very simple, very easy way. And I guess from the customers, how are they using it? They would primarily be taking existing processes that they have and using it as an opportunity to look at those processes, to try and simplify them, to try and break those problems down into something a bit smaller. And then the tooling comes. If I could just spend a moment on that specific topic, that although we talk about automation tooling quite a lot, actually what we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of roll back to what the original problem is that we're trying to solve, the original process, and trying to simplify that. Because if you can imagine, if you've been running an environment for maybe 10, 15 years, you will have processes that perhaps have become quite complex, and we've always done it this way, so that's why we're going to continue doing it. When you come around to trying to automate some of these things, it's the best opportunity you're going to get to actually take those apart and to break them down to smaller problems, and then you apply a kind of automation layer on top.
Oh, great. And so, I mean, so we've kind of talked about Ansible there, but what are the other offerings within Red Hat's management portfolio?
Yes, so in terms of managing content, so one of the big things you have to do when you're automating your systems or processes is you need to have content first of all. So that's where tools like Red Hat Satellite would come in. And what that enables you to do is to effectively curate content, maybe from your developers, maybe you're pulling certain versions of Linux or whatever happens to be in, and you're able to centralize that into Satellite, version control that content, control exactly which content goes where. You may have security zones that only receive certain amounts of content. And that gives you a layer of control around the, it gives you a layer of control around content that if you have to deal with auditing, for example, or security compliance, or to make sure systems are patched, that's really where Satellite is going to give you some value there. And then again, Ansible itself, I know I mentioned it briefly already, but Ansible itself is effectively the language. It's the engine that allows you to automate. To give you an idea of how our customers perhaps are using it, we'll often go and speak to customers, and we'll ask them, what's your automation tooling like at the moment? And the manager or the team leader will say, well, actually, we don't really use anything at the moment. And then you'll see hands going up from some of the developers who are saying, actually, yes, we are using Ansible already because there's no overhead. It's very simple to get started. So that's where we then need to have a second conversation about how do we help you control that. So if you have all these different people automating their own way, you end up with complexity again. So that's where we would talk about something like Ansible Tower, which is effectively an orchestration tool that sits on top and allows you to get some governance over that automation.
I guess that's again, it's a massive thing in terms of compliance and industry regulations and just general security concerns. Having that fine level control over your systems and your applications and your deployments is absolutely critical to ensure that you're not vulnerable to any potential issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So if there was a checklist I were to give customers before they were looking to undertake automation, the first thing would be to try and simplify what you have, first of all. Don't necessarily take everything you've been doing for the last 10 years and say, right, we're going to automate all of this. It's usually to pick out a number of tasks that you perform regularly, that you're going to get some benefit from automating, and actually look at those processes first of all. Once you've distilled those down into a kind of perhaps a common set of problems that you can solve, then you can look at the automation stage. And usually things around auditing, security, they're the problems, it's the things that people don't really like to have to sit there and do. Nobody wants to sit there and check, has this patch been applied across 100 systems? So they tend to be quite good targets. And from a security perspective, security teams or audit teams really like it because it's repeatable. So that means, they can check whenever they like without having to rely on this kind of middleman that might be the infrastructure lead, for example.
And that's where Ansible Tower comes in, right? Because that's what gives you that kind of enterprise level dashboard and that visibility across all of your automation jobs across your estate, rather than just relying on individuals to run their jobs here and there kind of as they like, really.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually a little bit more than that. So, Ansible Tower obviously gives you the ability to, we see it, so one of my customers at the moment is trying to implement infrastructure as code. Okay, so they want to be able to rebuild things quickly. They want to be able to deploy and validate the state of things very quickly. So they're storing all of their code in a central repository where it's version controlled. It's very carefully audited, and there's a history of what's going on. And where Ansible Tower is going to help you there is you can potentially have, you can delegate. It's very easy to create things. So for example, if I was the database administrator, I might be creating a series of playbooks that would allow other people to perform operations that I previously would have only allowed someone that was a qualified database administrator to run. So I can actually help delegate some of that. Where we see that really being useful in large organizations is you tend to get a group of people perhaps across a distinct set of units that will start contributing these playbooks and starting to work together to create large libraries that are specific to that company. And then other people that come along, maybe they've just joined the company, they can quickly start reusing these components and actually creating almost like a flowchart of, I would like you to go and do this and then go and do this. And really to a business that brings reduced risk for people making mistakes. It removes some of the silo mentality because you aren't dependent on individuals so much anymore, and it makes it much faster to develop, and it just builds a level of trust within an organization that's very hard to repeat any other way.
And I guess that's another thing about Ansible as well, that it's effectively it's kind of a human readable language, right? You don't need a huge amount of sort of training, coding expertise in terms of actually being able to use it, which is a bit of a differentiator from some of the other solutions out there.
Yeah, even I can do it, right?
Well, it must be easy then.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the great things about Ansible is I've worked with a number of different frameworks over the years, and the nice thing about Ansible is, and the reason it's adopted so much, is the fact it's so simple. You can start, if you want to do something very simply, if you look at Ansible itself, there are 2,200 modules built into it already. So that's 2,200 different things that you potentially can almost drag and drop. So they might be web server, configuring web service to a specific state, it might be a database, it might be SE Linux, it can be anything that you would traditionally have had to go to a specialist to get configured and set up. You can define these standards in code and they can be reused. We've had people who've never used it before, and within half a day they're up and running. They're up and running with it, and within a week you can be an absolute expert of it. So yeah, it's very powerful.
And do some of these playbooks then get shared with the wider community as well, for specific vendors or specific devices and so on?
Yes, so I mean, the way Red Hat work generally is we will a lot of the innovation is happening upstream. So what that means is that within the open source community, Ansible is actually a project there. We have people from all around the world, from all kinds of backgrounds, whether they're working for networking companies, whether they're working for database companies, who are contributing playbooks because they're experts in their field. They contribute it, and what Red Hat effectively do is we write our own playbooks, we're contributing them as well, but we provide a level of kind of validation to make sure they work as they should work, that they're documented, that they're tested against all the hardware certifications we have. So that's really where the innovation is happening, and then we take that and it's we test it, and any bugs or things we find, we feed back upstream. But the product that you get in terms of Ansible has been tested. So we're very closely tied to the community. It's a symbiotic relationship, and it works very, very well.
Great, thank you. And is sort of increasing cloud adoption, is that fueling the need for more management and automation as well? And I don't know, obviously with Red Hat Cloud Forms, if that sits more within the kind of the hybrid cloud pillar within Red Hat, or within the management and automation, or whether it's kind of sitting across both pillars.
Yeah, so in terms of tooling for hybrid cloud, my personal view on this and the way I'm seeing it used very heavily is Ansible Tower probably is the tool that's being used to kind of create these estates in the cloud that maybe need to be ripped up and torn down and then rebuilt again quickly. They're great. It's great for ephemeral workloads because you can repeat it in a very standard way very quickly. I mean, you mentioned Cloud Forms. One of the things that Cloud Forms is, I would say, it's real. The most powerful use case we have at the moment is really around using that as a kind of front end for users to be able to interact with tools like Tower. So Ansible Tower itself has a GUI where you could go in and you could give users the ability to go and run this and run that. But sometimes you don't want your users to know what's going on behind the scenes. And a great way to do that is to use Cloud Forms as a kind of catalog. So you can expose complex services in a very simple way to users, and you can do, charge back, show back, and all of those good things as well. Control how they use it, perhaps. So a good example would be if, actually we use this internally. So here's one. We have a training system. If we want to spin up a course for a week for a set of customers, we actually use we'll use Cloud Forms that sits in front of Ansible Tower, and it will spin up perhaps 10 machines per student. We'll send out usernames and passwords and all those good things, and then when the end of the week comes up, we can actually automatically tear those systems down. And so from an orchestration perspective, it's really easy to use, and it's very high level.
Yeah, I actually did an OpenShift workshop a while back, which I think some of those systems were being deployed in the background using some of that technology. So again, come back to what Phil said, it's so easy, even I can use it, right? So no, it's great, thank you. So I guess it would be interesting to kind of understand where the crossovers with, sort of the automation piece and the integration piece sit, and how some of the automation tools can be used to bring more value and simplify some of the integration work as well. Is that a typical kind of use case for Ansible as well?
Yeah, so I've got a really good example of that. So when I talk about automation, what I'm typically talking about is how I go about taking my code, compiling my code, creating a container image, and then deploying that container image in a very short pipeline into my production environment. But also there's often a lot of infrastructure that goes with what I'm trying to do. And so a great example of that is that for people that have seen me do my Agile integration demos, they will know that I'm using 3-scale, OpenShift, Fuse, and all of this good stuff. And one of the challenges that we have internally is the environment I run on isn't stable. And so to actually create my environment would take me 3 to 4 days worth of effort. And the reason why I say even I can do Ansible is what I've done is to automate the whole thing. So I can actually start with source code. I can start with all my templates that I need to deploy onto OpenShift, all of the images that I've got, and I can automate that all the way through using Ansible. So I can start with nothing, press the button, it still takes a while, an hour and a half to 2 hours later, it's all provisioned for me, but I've had to do nothing other than press the button. So absolutely, so there's a big crossover in where we can use these things together and use the right right tool for the right job. Yeah, so absolutely.
Could I possibly just add on to that as well, which is the environment that Phil's talking about? Although we it's based on OpenShift, what we actually do internally is, because we have a number of technical people that very often will go and try something that's quite destructive on an environment, we're using Ansible Tower internally they can press a button, it spins them up an OpenShift environment, they can be destructive with it. When they finish with it, or if they make a mess of it, we have an Ansible script that just pulls it down, it tears it down again, and they can just redeploy if they want to, and it's all push button. It needs to be, because we all have real day jobs to do, so we're actually our own customers, and we use it very heavily.
Great, and I guess that's something really key about Ansible, that whether you're automating just a very small process within your business, or whether you're getting involved in these very, very complex integrations, it can really add value by just making that whole process smoother and faster and easier, and as you said, reduce the potential for any kind of errors in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So we've had a question from the audience just regarding Ansible here, so maybe this is something that you can answer. I'm not quite sure what this is, but which GP is required for Windows servers to communicate with Ansible Tower? Does that make sense to you? I'm not sure on the GP.
If assuming they mean connection protocol, we'll just double check. But so I'll just mention it anyway, and hopefully it will cover it. If not, then please let us know. So under the hood, it actually uses WinRM when we talk to Windows servers.
Group policy is the GP apparently.
Which GP does it use? Okay, so which GP is required? So I'm not sure I can give you a specific group policy because that would definitely vary within different companies. But all we ask for is that you have WinRM enabled, and we've got a set of requirements which I'd be happy to share in anything you send out afterwards that actually details exactly what's required there. It's just a WinRM connection on Windows 2008 R2 and higher. So I mean, if you've got a specific question around which component of a group policy you're not sure on, we can certainly find out. I'd be happy to find out for you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, we'll wait and see if any more questions come in. So is there any other kind of, sort of key considerations or technologies that you feel it's worth highlighting at this point, either around sort of the integration portfolio or the management portfolio?
Yeah, so I've talked about integration, of course, but integration is just one part of a bigger ecosystem that it lives within. And also I sort of briefly mentioned that there's microservices as well that typically forms part of this. And so often so I've talked about the technology, but what I haven't really talked about is the architecture. And so what we have at Red Hat is an architecture for Agile integration as well. And that architecture focuses on a layered approach to how we build these things together. And so within that layering, we would have, as I talked about before, the API gateway management layer coming down into orchestration layer that then comes down into my base services layer. And once I get to my base services layer, that's typically where my business logic lives, if that makes sense. Now, we also have customers that implement that business logic with Fuse as well. So customers will actually implement their microservices with Fuse, which sounds a bit weird for an integration technology. But the fact of the matter is that when we're actually taking this concept that I talked about, which is enterprise integration patterns, and I'm orchestrating those together to be something, then there's no reason why that couldn't be business logic as well. Now, also within that reference architecture, we think about other things. So I think you were talking earlier, Andy, about things like scalability and those type of things that we might have within our Agile integration architecture. And so if I'm writing a whole bunch of microservices on OpenShift and then I'm orchestrating them with Agile integration, if one of those actual APIs or services that I'm consuming is legacy, then whilst I can scale at my end, they can't scale at their end. So I talked a little bit earlier about things like messaging and things like that, which tends to be for pushing information in, but doesn't really help getting information out. And so often what we think about with APIs is that if I do a get, I have to respond with an answer. And so if that system is slow because it's legacy or can't scale for other reasons, whatever it may be, then I need to think about other things in my architecture. So things like caching, for example. And so within Agile integration, we have caching capabilities as well. So rather than hitting that back end every time, I can source the data from a cache. So it just makes things really quick. Also, sitting in this world, we often think about people. So, most organizations have them, and most organizations aren't going to get rid of them anytime soon, or at least I hope. And so often what we think about in these applications is, how do I orchestrate my people as part of the solution? And so, sure, I can email people, I can ring people, I can text people, but in terms of a business process, wouldn't it be easier to automate that too? And so also part of our Agile integration solution, we can put things in like our process automation tool. And that allows me not only to then orchestrate my services, but orchestrate my people for the better good of the organization and to make things much more efficient. So I guess the point I'm making is that whilst Agile integration in a sort of very tunnel focused way is how do I integrate, how do I transform, how do I move a file to a message queue or whatever it may be, how do I expose APIs, there's also another picture where we can look at sort of horizontal solutions across that for integrating people, doing things like caching, and there's lots of and doing things like business rules. So if we are looking at using things like Fuse to build the microservices and implement the business rules, it would make sense to externalize those business rules using sort of decision management. So externalizing those that allows those to be changed quickly, frequently, baked onto an OpenShift platform means I can make changes quickly and move them through a life cycle into production quickly as well. So when you look at the total Red Hat middleware solution as part of Agile integration, it becomes even more powerful and all-consuming in what we can do.
And a lot of the time, these processes and systems already exist within these organisations, right? It's just a matter of digitizing them in a way, and as you say, automating them and taking some of that workload away from the people.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the other thing is that when we are using let's call it off-the-shelf applications, so whether that be a SaaS application, whether that be an SAP on-premise, whatever it may be, one of the things that we often talk about in integration land is that it is not to customize that application. If you customize the application, you've just created yourself a whole world of pain down the line, because it's just really hard to then move to different versions, to do different things, and it just becomes very difficult. And so often what we talk about is treat that application as clearly as a system of truth, for example, of whatever it's holding, but your differentiation should be in an integration layer, not in the application. So if you chose to move from, say, Salesforce to another, I'm not sure there is another sales automation tool these days, but if you were to move to another sales automation tool, then your differentiation goes with you, because it's in the middle tier, it's not actually in the application. So often that's a great way to think of how you can innovate around things like SaaS applications when people are using those as well, and to avoid putting customization into those applications. But of course you do need to differentiate, because if we all use Salesforce, then we're all exactly the same. So differentiation should be in middleware.
Great, thank you. Again, I'm learning more and more with each passing minute. Thank you. And Matt, so sort of same question there, sort of around the automation piece. Then, anything else that's sort of particularly interesting and sort of driving these opportunities from your point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. So I say that probably the main drivers we're seeing at the moment are people are not so much looking for just looking for processes that can be sped up, or it's not about saving time. Most of the time we see automation being used as about consistency. So the biggest problem that we've always sort of had within IT really is people. It's not that we want to get rid of people, but it's the fact that people, if you ask 3 people to follow the same set of instructions, it will be slightly different every time, and that's just the nature of where we are. So I would say consistency is probably the most important, is the number one reason that people are looking to automate. Speed and scale are obviously close behind, but if you can't be consistent, you can't rely on it. And whenever we talk about automation to customers, nearly all of it is about putting in what we call it's layers of abstraction. So if I can provide a guarantee to the layer above me that something is going to be consistent, then it makes it a lot easier to abstract that and to give that away and delegate that to somebody else. So whenever I talk about automating all the way up to the top, to the application level, we talk about effectively, we create the smallest possible operating system we can create, and then that becomes a guarantee. Then we apply some customization to it. That becomes the next guarantee. And then by the time you get to the application developers, they know what they're going to get. They're developing to a standard. That might be they're doing it in a container. They may still be using traditional applications that have to be downloaded and built. And even in those use cases, we're seeing application developers who are using Ansible playbooks. They used to, in the old days where I used to live, used to get a release note shipped to you. And they would say, look, here's a tar file full of all my files, here's a release note, and I want you to follow this and to build that out. And now we're seeing those release notes being replaced by Ansible playbooks that are version controlled with the software, which means that you kind of have this layer of consistency all the way up. Yeah, so that's primarily, it's all about consistency. That's really the most important thing.
Great, thank you. I've got a good question here around the automation conversation. So, question here is just curious, if we aren't speaking directly to developers, what would you suggest is the best entry point for an automation conversation? In other words, sort of what job role, use cases would be most likely to resonate, but if you're not talking directly to the developers?
Okay, so if you're not talking directly to developers, you know, your team, your environment will have, you know, some kind of deliverable that needs to go out. It might be, I would suggest, if you're looking for somewhere to start, if I've understood the question correctly, a good thing to do would be to look at what's taking up most of your time in terms of a particular problem, and then look at breaking that down and trying to simplify it. At the end of the day, what the developers are looking for, and Phil, feel free to correct me here, is really they're looking for a guarantee about what they're going to deploy on. So even if you aren't talking directly to a developer, you're likely going to be building an environment to a specific standard, and that's by automating that gives you the flexibility. You may be doing that on, you know, on-prem now, but if you automate in the correct way, you'll be able to, you know, very simply move that across to a cloud environment later on, or perhaps you know, a private cloud within your own environment.
And I guess to some extent, you know, if you're having conversations with anyone within IT departments, whether that's IT managers, you know, everyone is interested in how they can actually run their business more efficiently, reduce time for deployment, reduce human intervention and error. So it just comes down to kind of exploring what those particular challenges are within that organization and then kind of going in from there. But it's an interesting one. I think if anyone has some sort of very specific examples or questions that they'd like to talk to us about, then obviously please follow up with us after the webinar, and we can kind of look at your specific case in a little bit more detail.
I mean, if I could just say just quickly, in terms of having those conversations with with, you know, other people around, you'll probably find that the guys who are on the ground are already automating. It's just whether you as an organization have visibility of that. They will be using their own tools. They will likely, you know, already have their own processes. So from an organization perspective, a really good conversation to have is around how can we help you control that, and how do we help these people share the work that they're doing, and to make it reusable and consumable without, you know, without there being the risk of what if this person leaves and takes the scripts with them.
Great, thank you. Right, let's pass this back over to Phil. Okay, I think Phil, you back online?
Yep.
Great, okay, thank you. So yeah, I'm not sure if we'll have any more questions, but if there is anything you'd like to ask, then please send it through on the web chat, and we'll answer those in the next few minutes. But otherwise, I think we can probably start to wrap up. Phil, is there anything else that you feel is relevant around sort of obviously the integration piece, but anything else within the wider Red Hat portfolio at this point?
Well, for me, it comes back to sort of what I said at the beginning. Really, I'm not a very passionate talker, and so the passion often doesn't come out. But this agile integration approach to doing things is the right thing to do. Having been in integration for so long, using tools such as the Red Hat tools and the architecture that we have in an agile DevOps cultured type of way is the only way that the bricks and mortar organizations are going to survive, and that's something that I feel really strongly about. And it frustrates me when I'm talking to some customers that they just don't get it. It's just, if we sit here and do what we continue to do forever, we'll survive forever. And it literally, you know, people literally are going to eat their dog food if they don't do this. So it's definitely the right approach to do. It's definitely the right technology to do it with. And coming back to sort of Matt's point there about automation as well, is even if I'm not doing things like OpenShift, automation at the infrastructure level is so important for me as a developer. If I've had a great idea and I've written some code or I've done some integration, whatever it may be, but it's going to take me 3 months to get that into production because there's a whole load of manual things that need to be done and whatever else, then there was no point me doing it effectively. So it's absolutely key that sort of infrastructure automation, integration automation, and just automation in general goes right the way across the sort of DevOps chasm, if you like, and fulfills the need that we have. In terms of technology, I've probably said everything I need to say on technology, unless people want to know more.
No, that's great, thank you. We've had one more question come in about Ansible. So the question is, Ansible itself has a huge user base already. What approach does Red Hat use to upsell the benefits of adopting Ansible Tower?
Yes, so just to reiterate your point, absolutely, Ansible has a massive user base that's very active. There's a lot of code being committed, and just trying to keep track on, what goes in or out of Ansible is the full-time job for a large number of people that are helping maintain the project. So, in terms of when we talk about upselling to Ansible Tower, most of the time the conversation is, my developers, my infrastructure guys are using Ansible already. It's on their laptops. It's not, because it's so simple, it doesn't need to be installed. It doesn't take 6 weeks of setting up to put it in. Organizations are usually delighted by the benefits, that it makes things much quicker to deliver, but there's this element of control. It always comes back to control of, how do we know what they're doing? How can we audit what they're doing? How can we make sure that they aren't just downloading playbooks that have been written by somebody we don't know? So Ansible Tower, yes, orchestration is great from a functionality point of view. It gives you, Phil mentioned about APIs earlier. API is king for anything that's, any applications that are talking to each other. And Ansible Tower does give you all those additional features, but primarily it's about control. It means that the company is back in charge of what's happening.
And I guess if you've got a lot of people who are using Ansible within the organization, you don't necessarily know who's doing what with it, and Ansible Tower has that kind of audit trailability, so that you can actually see exactly who's doing what, who's got access to the different systems and so on. So it gives you a much greater view from a security perspective as well.
Absolutely. So the granularity that you get, you can see every single command that's being run from Ansible to a particular system. You can see which systems were affected by it. You can see whether there was an impact of the command that was run. Has something changed? So from a point of view of being able to audit, that's very, very powerful. One particular use case we see often is, we always used to have a bit of a tussle with our kind of change management teams. So whenever I would say, look, I want to do a particular, I want to make a change in my environment, and the change management teams would say, right, you wait 7 days and we'll vet it and we'll get all these people to look at it. If you can demonstrate to them in advance that this is exactly the same process we have run repeatedly before, we're changing a few parameters, here's the exact run in a test environment of what we're going to do, it makes that conversation with change management teams an awful lot easier, and really brings the kind of level of the conversation down to something a lot more amicable than sometimes it is with change management teams.
Great, thank you. Okay, so it's now 11 o'clock, so I don't think we have any more questions. So just a big thank you for joining us on the webinar today, and a big thank you to Phil and Matt for your time this morning. Thank you very much. If anyone viewing does have any more questions, or you'd just like to learn a little bit more about some of the technologies or about Red Hat, then please don't hesitate to contact either us at CMS or at Red Hat, and we will help you out. So yeah, anything you need, please let us know. Thank you for joining us. Cheers.